Good evening, everybody. I'm Brigitta van Rijnberg, the Editor-in-Chief and History Editor at Princeton University Press. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to the second of Ian Buruma's three-part Princeton public lectures about the vast issue of religion and democracy on three continents: America, Asia, and Europe. Last week, Ian talked to us about the roots of American religion, and he made the point that there really are some very close affinities between America and Europe. This evening's lecture is about Asia, and it's entitled The Wisdom of the East. And appropriately, tonight we have Shel Garan, historian of Japan and East Asia, introduce Ian Buruma. Shel Garan is the Dodge Professor of History and East Asian Studies here at Princeton, and the author, among others, of a book called Molding Japanese Minds, The State in Everyday Life. He's right now working on a wonderful and also very timely book, to be published by Princeton University Press, I'm very proud to say, called Fashioning a Culture of Thrift, Promoting Savings in Japan and the World, in which he compares the savings culture of Japan with that of the United States and several European and Asian nations. Shel.
Thank you, Brigitta. It's really a pleasure to be here to introduce my friend and colleague, Ian Buruma. We've known each other for about 10 years now. To say the least, if you were here last week, you already know that Ian Buruma is a prolific writer, and if I were to enumerate and describe all of the books and all the influential articles he's written in the New York Review of Books or the New York Times or the Guardian, we would be here all night and you would not hear him. So I'm going to not go over that, since Gary Bass gave a fine introduction last week. But I would like to point out three special traits of Ian Buruma that at least come to my attention. The first is his amazing spatial reach, which you got some glimpse of last week when Gary Bass introduced him and in his speech itself. There is, as many of you know, an interest among historians now in what we call transnational or transregional history, looking at certainly different nations and their linkages, but also looking across regions. It's something that we historians are trying to do now, but it's challenging because it involves research in many sites. It involves different use of language. It's something that we talk a lot about, we don't particularly do well. Ian Buruma has been doing this sort of transregional research and writing all of his career. He, as you learned last week, is a master of 6 languages: English, Dutch, Japanese, Chinese, French, and German, all of which he uses in his writing. And he basically literally darts back and forth between Europe, between Japan. He brings things together, and he shows us that on this globe that there's actually quite a commonality and certainly linkages among ideas and among the conditions that humans face. To give you some sense of the spatial reach, those of you who were here last week may be surprised to learn that between the time he was here and the lecture tonight, he's also darted back and forth across the Atlantic. He was in the Netherlands to receive the Erasmus Prize, and I need to describe what that is. It's for making important contributions to culture science or social science in Europe. But that's not the only prize he won this year. He also won the Shorenstein Journalism Prize for helping American readers understand the, quote, complexities of Asia. Now, to be sure, I don't think he's won a prize for Antarctica. On the other hand, he's got one more week to go. He may go away again, and who knows. But there's a second trait that comes to mind, because we've been talking about winning the Shorenstein Journalism Prize. He is a journalist. People sometimes forget that, but that is basically how he came up in his career. And what he does that is exceptional, maybe not quite unique, but very, very unusual, is he really marries the best of journalism and scholarship. He has a journalist's knack for talking to people, listening to people, being very open-ended, going around the world in all these languages doing it. And he has the scholar's knack, unlike many journalists in this country, for actually tracing things down, looking at sources, literary and historical. His final trait, and those of you who know him, knows that he's a man who does not shrink from controversy. Indeed, he loves controversy. He loves to provoke in the best sense of the word. And I saw this when I first met him some 10 years ago here at Princeton. It was for a conference. It was, I believe, the very first conference in this country on an unpleasant topic, the Nanjing Massacre, the Japanese massacre of Chinese in the city of Nanjing in 1937 and 38. This conference was a minefield. On one side was a Japanese scholar, Professor Hata, an eminent scholar, but who had turned apologist for, in a sense, minimizing the atrocities of Nanjing and simply coming up with small body counts and stopping it at that. On the other side was Iris Cheng, the late Iris Cheng, the author of The Rape of Nanking. I think it's subtitled The Forgotten Holocaust, who insisted that the Nanjing Massacre was the Holocaust, or was a type of a Holocaust, and also insisted that all Japanese were unremorseful, and indeed that they prayed and worshipped Tojo at the Yasukuni Shrine. In between this, I can't say that Ian was a peacemaker. That was not his role. But he certainly was a voice of reason, challenging both sides, particularly Iris Cheng in this case, and doing it with, I think, tremendous responsibility. Now, tonight, he's going to be, again, demonstrating his exceptional grasp of issues all around the globe. We had Europe last week. This week, it is wisdom from the East, but which I believe he means East Asia and not the state of New Jersey. And so I would like to now turn things over to him and to welcome him back to Princeton.
Thank you very much once again, and for that kind introduction. Again, it's an honor to be here. Last week I read my lecture, which I believe some people found a little bit too dense. So by way of an experiment, I'll today speak from notes at the risk of sounding not quite dense enough, but we shall see. Last week, the talk was really about Christianity, and it was a comparison of the United States and Europe. And often, when these things are talked about, the problems of religious authority and secular political authority and how they're kept separate or how they merge, people blame the problems of this issue on monotheism. And it's one of these cliches that somehow polytheistic societies don't really have these problems. I mean, they may have other problems, but in this sense they have more wisdom. And it's monotheistic societies that tend to be dogmatic and absolutist and so on, and therefore create greater problems in this department than societies that don't have monotheism. Now, I'd be the last to wish to defend monotheism here, but a look at East Asia, and indeed I do mean Japan and China, and I confine myself to those countries partly for self-serving reasons, because they're the places I know best, but also because I think they are actually quite interesting examples of how polytheistic societies actually struggle with problems with church and state that are not entirely dissimilar to the problems that we have in monotheistic civilizations. And I'd like to start with Matteo Ricci, the Italian missionary Jesuit who arrived in China in 1583. And like most Jesuits, tended to go native, and very quickly was dressed in silk Mandarin robes, and tried to convert the Chinese to Christianity by the odd means of teaching them all about European science. But the interesting thing about, and Ricci was somebody, and like all Jesuit missionaries at the time, who was strongly criticized by Catholics of different orders in Rome and elsewhere, partly because they disapproved of the tendency to go native, and partly for other reasons. But the main problem, I think, that the Jesuits faced, or the Catholics or the Christians faced in general, was that China was rarely a counterexample to a worldview that they all shared. And it was namely this. Ricci was a great admirer of Chinese civilization, and particularly Confucian culture. He was not an admirer of Buddhism and Taoism, which he dismissed as forms of superstition, but he was a great admirer of Confucian civilization. And nobody could really deny that China had had a great civilization with codes of moral and ethical conduct and so on, which preceded Christianity. Now, this, of course, did pose a serious challenge to the Christian worldview, because if you could have a highly evolved and sophisticated ethical and moral civilization without, before Christ, and without a belief in God, then where did that leave the Christians? Didn't that mean perhaps that it was possible to have a high system of ethics and morals without belief in God? Now, of course, to any pious Christian, this was impossible. And indeed, the Jesuits and Matteo Ricci, who may have been more sophisticated than many others, other Catholics at the time, but they had to conclude that the Chinese did indeed have a belief in a higher being, in a God, but that this belief had been corrupted in later ages by superstitions and so on, but that their civilization had indeed been due to a belief in a God which had been there earlier. Now, not all Europeans in the 17th and 18th century who thought about China shared this view. The followers of Spinoza in France and Holland and other countries also admired Chinese civilization, and specifically Confucian civilization. But actually, they thought that Confucianism and the success and refinement of Confucian culture proved that it was proved what Spinoza actually had been saying all along, that it was possible to have a highly evolved system of ethics and morals without a belief in God. In other words, that you didn't need divine revelation for people to behave in an ethical and moral manner. And many of the Spinozists and the followers of Spinoza actually compared Confucius to Spinoza and saw Confucius as one of the first truly rationalist thinkers in the history of mankind. And there are, I suppose, if you look at the little, we don't know all that much about Confucius, but if you look at his thoughts as they've been relayed by his followers, there are reasons to find this a plausible view of Confucius. One of the famous dialogues in Confucius' Analects has the following words. One of his followers or one of his disciples asks Confucius how to serve the spirits and the gods. And Confucius answers, "You are not yet able to serve men, so leave spirits and the gods until later." The same disciple asked him about the afterlife, and Confucius says, perhaps we should confine our efforts to this life and then think of the afterlife later. Now, some people have taken this to be proof of Confucius' atheism, in the sense that Spinoza was an atheist. Others deny that and say that all it shows is that Confucius was telling his disciple that he was out of his depth, but it didn't actually show that Confucius didn't believe in a higher being, and indeed he probably did, as most people did at his time. He did believe in the forces of heaven and that he had a heavenly mission to improve the world and so on, and it doesn't prove that he was not a religious man, but his ethical system indeed is a secular one and a hierarchical one, and he talked about the way people should behave to their elders, to their parents, to their political superiors, and so on. And it was a carefully worked out ethical system that was not in any way metaphysical. And so the Spinozists were probably right in that sense. But that doesn't mean that the politics of his time had no religious connotations at all. In fact, Chinese politics, even Confucian politics, are, to some extent, metaphysical in the sense that they are a reflection of a certain cosmological view of the world. The Chinese rulers, the emperors, were in many ways the sort of the mediators between heaven and earth. And if you look at Confucian thought, the way that politics worked was not based on laws and contracts, but they were based on ethics and rights, and the idea that the rulers and those who worked for the emperor were superior people of superior virtue, people who exemplified a certain moral ideal, and that's what gave them the legitimacy to rule. It was a moral question, and a question that was in many ways related to a certain religious view of the world. The role of the mandarins, the scholar officials, was to make sure that the emperor remained a virtuous figure, and in theory, if he did something that departed from his virtuous path, it was their role to criticize him. Now, I say in theory because if in fact you did this, you could very well find yourself headless in very short order. And some people did. Some mandarins did take this seriously with rather dire consequences. But in any case, that was the way it was done. But what is important, I think, to keep in mind that the emperor was in many ways a figure who played a central role in a cosmological view of the world, a view that was in many ways religious, and to make sure that relations in the world and politics in the world and that harmony in society was preserved. You had to make sure that harmony of society matched the harmony of heaven and the cosmos. And for that, it was important to carry out religious rites. And so the emperor was, in some ways, a pope-like figure who was the leader of a kind of state cult, as well as a secular political leader with a great deal of power. Now, contrary to what some modern propagandists or promoters of Asian value, mostly in Singapore, would like us to believe, namely that it is the natural in Chinese or Sinic civilization for people to obey their rulers no matter what. Both Confucius and Mencius did leave room for legitimate rebellion against political rule if the cosmos was no longer in order, if the emperor could no longer guarantee order and harmony on earth, or indeed could guarantee that people had enough to eat, then it was justified to rebel. But the rebellion usually was, and naturally, was not simply a political rebellion. Rebellions in Chinese history were always done in name of correcting the corruption of a society. In other words, the morals of the rulers, or even of new rulers, but it was a moral issue. Moral men had to restore the morality of society in order to get the mandate of heaven, that is to say, the legitimacy to rule all that was on earth. Now, despite this, Voltaire, who was another great admirer of Chinese civilization, still believed that what was best about Chinese civilization was its rationalism. And of course, one has to take what Voltaire said about China and other men of the Enlightenment too, with a slight grain of salt, because like many much later admirers of China in our own time, in the 1960s and 70s, admirer of Maoism, for example, Voltaire wasn't, of course, interested in China for China per se. He was interested in China because it was far away enough that it could be used conveniently as a counterexample, as a stick with which to beat everything that was bad in the society in which Voltaire played a role, namely that of France, that was under an absolute monarchy and the absolutism of the Catholic Church. And so he needed a kind of counterexample. He needed something to criticize what he thought was corrupt and unjust about his own society, and China was extremely useful for that. But he believed that China had this, again and again, he was thinking of Confucianism in particular, had this wonderful philosophy, this highly evolved, civilized philosophy that was moderate in all things, that was rational, and what was perhaps most important for Voltaire and other intellectuals of the Enlightenment, it was a system in which philosophers, scholars, had the right to rule, to administer the empire. Now, again, this was perhaps it was certainly an idealized view of China, but it was very much how he saw things. And it is perhaps ironic that less than 100 years after Voltaire said all these fine things, China had one of the most convulsive and violent religious uprisings in relatively modern history, namely the uprisings of the Taiping, which happened in the middle of the 19th century, after China's weakness, relative weakness, had been demonstrated cruelly by the Opium Wars, in which the British dictated their terms on the Chinese by their superior force of arms. And round about that time, a failed Confucian scholar, a scholar who had tried several times to pass his exams that would have made him a scholar official and given him an official role in the Chinese state, had a dream. And of course, failed intellectuals are always highly dangerous figures. And UChannel was certainly one of those. And in his dream, based on a superficial reading of the Bible that he was handed by a Western missionary in Canton, I believe, the Son, Jesus Christ, appeared to him and revealed that UChannel, this failed scholar, was his brother, and it was his role to pass on the word of God to the Chinese people. And Hung took this seriously and started this missionary movement, first in southern China. He was also a Hakka Chinese, a member of a minority, and so he started with the Hakkas first and tried to convert the Chinese to his particular view of Christianity. And this movement grew and grew, was highly successful, until they took Nanjing, and it became a little empire in China, and it was called the Kingdom on Earth. And it was in some ways a remarkably enlightened or modern kingdom on Earth, and some aspects of it would come back later and we can still recognize. For example, the Taipings were in favor of emancipation of men and women, even though men and women had to live separately in separate quarters and so on, but women had important roles in the administration of the kingdom on Earth. And that was it was also highly egalitarian compared to the traditional China. So there were interesting aspects to the Taiping, but as often happens, Hung began to more and more to behave like a traditional emperor, and even though his subjects in the heavenly kingdom would be beaten to death if they committed adultery, Hung, like a traditional emperor, quickly amassed a harem of concubines and began in other ways to behave more and more like an autocratic emperor. And things began to unravel very quickly. A rival to Hung, which is of course also very much part of all new religious ventures of this kind, a rival appeared who declared that he was actually the Holy Ghost and therefore superior to Christ's younger brother. And it went downhill from there. And the troops of the Qing dynasty cracked down on Nanjing, helped by Western powers, who at first were rather sympathetic to Hung because they saw a fellow Christian in him, but later saw it as a threat to the status quo, and helped the Qing restore the authority of the Qing dynasty. And by the end of extremely bloody battles, first of all, Nanjing was starved into submission, even though Hung promised his followers that manna would fall from heaven, something which didn't happen, of course, and many people starved. And after it was all over, around about 30 million people had died as a consequence of this heavenly vision. Now, Voltaire might have been strengthened in his view because of this story that monotheism and Christianity were the noxious element that created this violence and bloodshed in China, and that without this Christianity, none of this would have happened. Now, that may be so, but it was a very peculiar kind of Christianity that Hong Shui-chen had introduced. And in fact, it is probably more accurate, and Jonathan Spence has written a wonderful book on this whole episode. It's probably more accurate to see Hung as a rather more traditional Chinese figure who had a millenarian ideal and tried again in the way that peasant rebels and millenarian rebels have all through Chinese history to fight what he saw as the corruption of a decadent dynasty by overthrowing it in name of a new morality, of men of pure intentions, who could restore China to its moral purity, and so on. So it was, although the religious aspect of the rebellion had Christian symbols and Christian marks, it was, in my view, and not only in my view, obviously, but it was a much more traditional kind of millenarian rebellion than it was a Christian one. And it showed, I think, how Chinese politics, especially when it comes to rebellion, but also when it comes to legitimizing power, are metaphysical and do have to do with religion, even though it's not a monotheistic one. Now, Chairman Mao was a great admirer of Hong Shui-chen. He saw him, and so was Karl Marx, by the way, who was obviously not an expert on the subject, and he had other strange prejudices about Asia. He was rather in favor of imperialism, which is something many people don't know. But Mao admired Hong Shui-chen as a revolutionary, but he also admired a very different figure, who was the first emperor of China, the first unifier of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, who the builder of, he himself didn't build anything, but the one who was responsible for the first parts of the Great Wall, who was a great standardizer of Chinese script, of money, and so on, and was really the first one to make China into a unified nation in the 3rd century before Christ. And Qin Shi Huangdi had a very different conception of rule than the heavenly kingdom on earth did. He was a believer in the use of the law, but he was a legalist. But he used the law, and so not rights, as the Confucianists did. He used the law in order to strike terror in the hearts of his subjects. He used law to intimidate people and mobilize people in large number to do slave work and build great walls and so on. But his form of legalism, using draconian punishments to rule by fear, was very different from the Confucianists. And indeed, he hated the Confucianists, and he was the first book burner in history. He insisted that the Confucian classics be burnt, because he was very much against something that was crucial to Confucian scholarship, which was to use the Confucian scholarship, the idea of Confucian scholarship and the scholar officials, was to use the ancient texts as a source not only of how a virtuous ruler should behave, but as a source of using the past, as they said, to criticize the present. And Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, was very much the type of dictator who started on a blank slate, who hated the past, and who hated above all people who used the past to criticize the present. And so, according to legend, we don't know enough about what was really going on there to say for sure, but according to legend, he buried the Confucian scholars alive after having burnt their books. But Qin Shi Huangdi was not a rationalist. Again, the European men of the Enlightenment would hardly have admired him. He, too, was somebody who used religion, metaphysics, to justify his rule. And indeed, Huangdi was an ancient word for a kind of godhead, which he, just as Napoleon much later, crowned himself. Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, as it were, crowned himself by calling himself by the name of an ancient deity, and saw himself in such terms. But they're very interesting Chinese terms. One of the things that legitimize any Chinese ruler is that they are seen to carry on Chinese civilization, to guarantee Chinese civilization. And what is Chinese civilization? And the scholar Simon Leys has written very well about this. It's not buildings, it's not paintings and so on, even though they're part of it. And one of the reasons people may be relatively indifferent to old buildings in our own time, and people are always astonished by the way that Chinese just seem to demolish old cities and just build anything that's new without seeming to care. One of the reasons may be that what Chinese civilization really is the written word. And passing on the written word is what is an enormously important task of the ruler, which is why even now, both in Japan and in China, any politician worth his salt will leave his calligraphy all over the place, in museums and so on. Even if they're lousy calligraphers, you'll see their calligraphy everywhere. Deng Xiaoping's calligraphy, Mao Zedong's calligraphy, Japanese prime minister's calligraphy, and so on. And the reason for this is to show that they are the guarantor of the continuity of civilization. And Qin Shi Huangdi went one further. He did exactly what Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and so on are also doing. He actually wanted to stamp nature itself with his calligraphy, as it were like an emperor putting his seal, his stamp, on ancient paintings. If you go to the museum, the National Palace Museum in Taipei, you can see the Qing emperors, how they would almost like vandals sort of take these ancient Sung dynasty paintings and put their seal all over it to show that it was theirs. Qin Shi Huangdi, like Kim Il-sung in North Korea much later, would literally have stamped enormous characters, Chinese characters, on sacred mountains and so on and so forth to show that all under heaven was his. But also, like all emperors and almost all religious leaders, he was obsessed with immortality. And he desperately wanted to be immortal. And would kill people who were foolish enough, soothsayers and so on, are foolish enough to predict that he would one day, like all human beings, come to his natural end. They were actually murdered. And I think that he set a pattern, in a way, although Qin Shi Huangdi went down in history as a great villain, until, again, Chairman Mao revived his status. Mao actually thought he was a bit soft and said that, and people say that Qin Shi Huangdi killed, hundreds of thousands of people. Well, that's nothing. We will kill millions and that sort of thing. But and because he was so anti-Confucian, and because Chinese history was written mostly by Confucians, Qin Shi Huangdi's gone down in history with a very bad name. But actually, he did set a pattern, I think, for a particular kind of Chinese rule, which combines, in many ways, fear, but also this metaphysical idea of being a kind of godlike figure, a divine figure who is at least in touch with heaven as a way to rule all that is under heaven, that is on earth. And I think when people talk about the separation of church and state and how it took place in Europe, the great question in Chinese history is really whether that ever completely took place. And one time it could have taken place was in 1911 with the Republican Revolution against the imperial system, led by Sun Yat-sen, among other people. And Sun Yat-sen himself was a Christian, and his ideas of, restoring China to a kind of moral purity, to stamp out the corruption of the ancien regime, was a mixture of his Christianity, of social Darwinism, believing that the Chinese people, like all peoples, were engaged in a struggle for survival, for racial survival, and that China needed to reinvigorate itself in order to survive in this struggle. But he also had, as I said, a very strong sense, in a traditional sense, of moral regeneration, of China as a place that had to be morally rescued from a foreign and corrupt and old regime. So that didn't quite separate church from state. Then there was the famous May 4th movement, a very important, crucial event in modern Chinese history, which started as a protest against the fact that after World War I, which Japan joined very, very late and without actually doing anything much, but as a kind of payoff for having joined the Allies against Germany in World War I, the German concessions in China were handed over to Japan, which was seen as a great humiliation by Chinese patriots and as a sign, again, of decadence, moral decadence and weakness of the Chinese government, which had to be corrected by this new movement. But the movement was more than that. The movement was also a kind of cultural regeneration led by students of Peking University and many Chinese intellectuals who had many ideas. One of them was a belief in science, an almost religious belief in science, that traditional Chinese civilization had become corrupt and decadent and so on, and only science and democracy which would regenerate China. This was not a belief in science as a kind of for instrumental reasons, but literally as a new moral belief, really. But it could have gone in many different ways. It could have become, there were liberals involved in March 4th, there were socialists, there were conservatives, and so on. But the way it went in the end was communist, which, again, I think appealed to the Chinese because they are a bookish people. It's based on ideas, on books, and it was Western, that is to say, modern, but it was not Christian. And it was something that promised the birth of a new man. And again, it promised a sort of a new moral order, which I think gave Chinese communism a great impetus. Then Mao took over, and Mao in many ways represented the worst of all sort of the worst modern ideas from the West, but also the worst of Chinese tradition, in that he and his admiration for the first emperor of China was part of this. He was a legalist on one side, that he used terror and draconian punishments to instill fear in people, but he was also worshipped, and he encouraged this, especially during the Cultural Revolution, as a godlike figure, to the extent that the religious hysteria of the Cultural Revolution was such that if somebody was seen to crumple up a newspaper which had an image of Mao on it, that could lead to a death sentence. And so it led to a kind of perversion of Chinese religious thought. Now, another pattern, as well as millenarian rebellion and the worship of rulers as divine figures and so on, another constant pattern in the history of Chinese politics is that that mandarins, the bureaucrats, gradually take over power from the charismatic millenarian revolutionary leaders who start new dynasties, and exactly that has happened in China too. And many people in China, most people in China, would be perfectly happy with that the sort of charismatic, they're spared the kind of charismatic leadership that Mao represented, even though many Chinese still worship as a kind of folk god. And now China is being ruled by rather grey and faceless bureaucrats, mandarins, who are anything but charismatic. And as a result of the demise of Maoism and the fervent belief of Maoism, many Chinese now are worried about what they call the spiritual vacuum. Well, actually, there isn't much of a vacuum in China, or at least it's been filled very quickly because it's become a great place now for new cults, new religions, beliefs, and so on, whether they are Taoist, Buddhist, or even Christian. There is a huge industry in that. And one way to understand the almost paranoid fear of the current Chinese government for a meditation cult, which is really pretty much all it was, like the Falun Gong, is precisely because the history of China, because people do know history, and the history of China so often has been driven by millenarian cults, by rebellions that went against the political order, but using religious ideals to try and build a new world. And in that sense, I think China still hasn't really solved its tensions between religious and political authority. And even though it's not a monotheistic society, it's hardly a model for us in the West who are struggling with our own problems with religion to follow. Now, I'd like to compare it with Japan. Now, Japan in many ways had an easier time of it finding a way to accommodate the modern world than the Chinese did. China thought of itself, or the Chinese thought of itself, and certainly the scholar officials thought of themselves as being in the center of the world. For them, it was a huge shock when they were confronted by superior Western power in the middle of the 19th century, when they were forced to realize that actually China was not in the middle of the world. It was an existential shock, a metaphysical shock. The whole sort of cosmological view of the world was challenged by the power of Western imperialism. The Japanese didn't have a problem of that severity because they were used to seeing themselves as a culture in the periphery. They'd always been on the periphery of Chinese civilization, and they knew it. They had always known, even though there were nativist reactions to this, but they'd always known that the center of the source of ethics, the center of civilization, was not in Japan, it was somewhere else. It was in Chang'an or in Peking or in Nanjing, but in any case not in Japan. And I think that in many ways this was a great advantage for Japan, still is to some extent. I think that being on the periphery, you have the virtue of provinciality in that it creates a curiosity and a flexibility of mind. You want to know what goes on elsewhere. You cannot expect the world to come to you all the time. It's why, let's say, people in Stockholm in some ways are better informed and more sophisticated than people in New York City, because nobody's going to go to Stockholm, and so they have to find out what's going on in the rest of the world, while people in New York City take it for granted that the rest of the world comes to them. So the rather unwise remarks of the member of the Nobel Prize Committee for Literature that the Americans don't translate enough was maybe tactless but not entirely untrue. Now, the Japanese were always great translators, much more than the Chinese. And the curiosity of the Japanese was such that even during the 200-odd years of relative isolation, when the Japanese government isolated Japan from Western powers, apart from the Dutch, who were allowed to stick on a little island outside Nagasaki because all they wanted was to trade and not to spread Christianity. Even in those days, the Japanese actually knew more about Western science and Western ideas and Western philosophies and so on than most other Asians did. largely through the heroic efforts of so-called Dutch scholars who would learn Dutch dictionaries by heart so that they could read medical texts and scientific texts and so forth. And so when faced with the superior power in the middle of the 19th century, when they saw what was happening in China during the Opium Wars, they saw the relative weakness of China. It was not so hard for the Japanese to realize that the center of civilization was no longer in China, it was elsewhere. It was now in Berlin or New York or Paris and London. But for them, that wasn't an existential or metaphysical shock. They could adapt to it because they had been used to it. The other thing that was different in Japan is that they had a de facto separation of religious and secular authority. During the Tokugawa period, that's the pre-modern period since the early 17th century, but actually before that even, the emperor was a kind of sacred figure, a pope, if you like, whose responsibilities, and he was in the old court city of Kyoto, and his responsibilities were cultural and religious. He took care of the rites to make sure, following the Chinese tradition, that the harmony in heaven was reflected in harmony on earth, and he would plant rice and do all these things. But actual secular authority, worldly authority, the political authority was in the hand of the shoguns, the military leaders, who were in the capital of Edo, which later became Tokyo. So the two were actually separate. Now it's more complicated. Some of the shoguns, after their death, were worshipped as deities as well, but nonetheless there was, practically speaking, there was a separation. Now when the Japanese, like the Chinese, like all non-Western nations, were faced with the power of the West, and in order to, and they were still lucky because they were so far away and so much in the periphery, they had not yet been colonized, but they were faced with the same problem. What do we do about this? How do we resist this? How do we make sure that we don't get colonized or dominated? Now, there are various things that they thought of. One was, to be a modern power that can resist Western imperial powers, we need an empire of our own. That was one conclusion. The other conclusion was that, and this was a rather Confucian way of looking at things, but when they tried to explain how Western power worked, why Western powers were so powerful, they thought this had to be because they had a religion, because there was a common religion that made people obey their rulers and sacrifice themselves for their nations and so on. And this religion had to be Christianity. And the Japanese, and this was argued by some nativist scholars, felt that the Japanese needed a similar religion of their own. And it couldn't be Christianity because that was Western. It couldn't be Buddhism because that was not Japanese either. It was Indian and Chinese. It had to be something else. So they looked to this, what was in fact a set of it was a nature cult, Shinto, which was a way of worshipping nature, making sure that they had good harvests and so on. Nothing much more than that. There was no ideology. But the idea was to make that into the kind of state cult with the emperor in the center. And so in order to rebel against the shogunate, the military government in Edo, the rebels took the emperor and restored him into the center of power, took him to Edo, the capital, and made him into a kind of mixture of a German Kaiser and a Napoleonic figure on a horse in a uniform, and a divine Pope-like figure who would mediate between heaven and earth. And what they were able to do by doing this, was something that the Chinese could not, which was to use an idea of tradition and use the illusion, if you like, of a cultural continuity to paper over a massive change. So no country westernized as fast as Japan did in the late 19th century, and as radically. But they somehow could paper this process over. They could lessen the shock by pretending, by restoring the power of the emperor, that it was actually a restoration of tradition, that it was a continuity of a kind, which the Chinese could not. And this, I think, proved to be a great advantage to the Japanese in their modernization. It proved also to be a disaster a little bit later. because there were great ambiguities in the system, the politics of modern Japan. One of them was that that they had a new constitution after the Meiji Restoration of the 1860s, when Japan became a modern state. And the constitution made the emperor, on the one hand, into a constitutional monarch along European lines. On the other hand, it stressed his role as the ancestor of the sun goddess, and left a kind of divine status. It was never quite, his authority was never quite clear. On the one hand, he was a constitutional monarch who was above politics. On the other hand, he was the supreme power and the commander of the armed forces. And it was made very clear in imperial rescripts that the soldiers and sailors had to be utterly loyal to him. Their obedience was to him and not much more than to elected governments, democratically elected governments. Now, this didn't matter so much, this ambiguity, as long as the original rebels of the mid-19th century, the so-called oligarchs, actually called the shots behind the scenes. As soon as they died off, there was a power vacuum in Japan in the early 20th century, which was then filled precisely by, on the one hand, the military, by military leaders, on the other hand, by state Shinto, by this religious idea and the cult of the emperor. So the cult of the emperor, a sort of religious notion of the state, of the polity, as a kind of divine entity, and wars in China and elsewhere fought as sacred wars, really only took hold it became radical and extreme only really in the 1930s, under the Showa emperor, because of the power vacuum. And that's when Japan became a sort of radical religious state, as it were. This came to an end after the defeat in 1945, and the first thing that the American or the Allied occupation, but led by the Americans and General MacArthur, the first thing they did was to formally separate church and state again. Christian members of MacArthur's administration were, of course, particularly keen on this, but they quite rightly saw that something had to be done about this. And this is why the emperor, the Japanese emperor, was told to make a speech on the radio to renounce his divinity, which didn't make a lot of sense to most Japanese because they'd never really thought of him as a god, but they did think of him as a sacred figure, because of his divine ancestry. But so he went on radio, renounced his divinity, but actually the ancestry part was never entirely addressed. But Shinto was no longer a state religion. It was separated from the state, from politics. And the Japanese, much to the delight of most citizens in Japan, decided to concentrate on economic development, on wealth, and as Prime Minister in 1960 put it, promised people would be able to double their incomes every year, and they would no longer talk about the emperor or anything to do with the war. It was all conveniently swept out of sight. People would henceforth concentrate on building the industrial and wealth of the nation and making Japan a rich nation, but no longer a militarily powerful nation or one that was submitted to anything like divine authority. Now, this left what's, again, like in China after Mao, what many people worry about, a spiritual vacuum. Again, like in China, it was not all that vacuous. Ever since the end of World War II, the early post-war period was actually called in the Japanese press, not for nothing, the rush hour of the gods, because what took the place of the emperor cult was a large number of sort of freelance religious movements, led by various charlatans and people there was a dancing religion. There were all kinds of women who pretended to have a direct pipeline to heaven and so on, and various Buddhist-derived religions. And so religion actually did very well. But nonetheless, people in the 70s, 60s, 70s, especially conservatives, began to worry seriously about this religious vacuum. On the one hand, this led to rather malevolent developments. And one thinks, for example, of the Aum Shinrikyo, the group of mostly highly educated people, often in the sciences, probably not for nothing, who followed somebody who was certainly a charlatan, a half-blind guru, who was steeped in a lot of rather half-baked Buddhist mumbo-jumbo, and had a apocalyptic view that that the world was going to come to an end, and after which the chosen followers of the Aum Shinrikyo would rule, and they tried to commit mass murder by putting sarin gas in the Tokyo subway. That was one form of freelance religion. But the perhaps more disturbing leftover of the past, of the confusion between religion and politics, you find on the right-wing fringes of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, of conservative think tanks, of certain comic book writers, and so on, people who are deeply worried that the spiritual vacuum left in the wake of secularizing the imperial system and of having a constitution written by Westerners, which very importantly has an article that makes it unconstitutional for Japan to use military force in its foreign policy. These people, since the end of the war, have always wanted to revive at least parts of the pre-war emperor cult, of state Shinto, of a divine emperor, of a strong Japanese military, and so on. Now, this has been successfully defied by the liberal left in Japan, of which less and less is actually left, but quite literally. But it was defied by pointing out what it led to, the devastation of Japan's adventures, military adventures on the Asian continent, and followed by World War II. And this is, of course, the main reason why those who wish to merge religion and politics again in the Japanese political system have a strong need to deny everything that was terrible about World War II, which is a rather somber note with which to end this second lecture. But I think it goes to show, and that's really what I was trying to demonstrate, it goes to show that the confusions and the tensions and the problems of mixing religious and secular authority are by no means confined to monotheistic civilization, but are actually a universal problem shared by countries which had very little, had no monotheistic tradition at all. Thank you very much. Please. Who's going to be the first brave? Yes.
I always thought that one of the differences between the Western monotheism and the Asian had to do with the idea of God or the one as personal or more abstract, or less personal.
Meaning, which would be the abstract and which would be the personal? And I would put it the other way around. I think that the idea of God, certainly in Christianity, even though children have this image of an old man with a beard and so on, is an abstract notion, and certainly in Judaism it is.
Well, the Jews are always talking about God as a person.
Yes, but a person whose name you're not allowed to mention. So that is fairly abstract, whereas in the polytheistic tradition, anything can become divine. Anything from a rock to a mountain to historical figures. And the fact that people in taxis in Chinese cities often have an image of Mao dangling from their mirror as a folk deity is a deeply traditional thing, and people with great power. It doesn't matter if they were mass murderers. In fact, being mass murderers is a demonstration of their power. which may not have been appreciated at the time, but it is certainly a demonstration of enormous power. And that so historic figures, historic generals, rebel leaders, emperors, and so on, often end up as folk deities. And that's a highly personal view of the divine.
What about the concept of heaven?
Well, heaven, I think, certainly, I'm quickly getting out of my depth because I'm not a Chinese religion expert, but I think heaven is a much more abstract concept, and not one the idea of going to heaven and so on is, although in Buddhism you have judges and you're judged for your life and there's reincarnation and all that, but the idea of being terrified of hell and what happens after you die, I think, is less pronounced in China and Japan. But I stand to be corrected. Must be more critical comments. Yes?
One of the things that always struck me about the West was the wars of annihilation. Wiping out of this house.
Yes, well, the Taiping is one of them, but millenarian revolts were often extremely bloody, and I personally, in the case of religious wars, including the wars in the Balkans quite recently, I personally am very skeptical about the notion that these wars begin because of religious differences. I think religious differences are used to mobilize people, usually for political reasons. And there are many instances of that in East Asia too. And if you just look, I mean, in Japan itself, in the Middle Ages, many monasteries were highly militarized institutions, and there was an enormous amount of fighting and the way that the Tokugawa shoguns, for example, put down the Christians was a very bloody business, helped by the Dutch, by the way, who wanted to do business and were not above helping the Japanese wipe out fellow Europeans for their own interest. But so yes, I don't think that again, I don't think that Europe and monotheistic cultures have a monopoly on religious violence. Take modern Sri Lanka. I mean, even Buddhism can become a mobilizing force for violence.
One of the other points one often hears about polytheistic religions is that they're more tolerant of diversity of all sorts. You spoke very interestingly about the relationship between politics and the sacred. I wonder if you could comment about other.
Well, up to a point, I think it's true in the sense that in polytheistic cultures, people tend to cover all bets. If one god doesn't work, another one will, there's some certain wisdom in that, and so there is a lot of tolerance, I think, for people who believe in different things at the same time. On the other hand, certainly that's true in China, but I would say the same is true in Japan. Is that the political legitimacy is often intimately linked with an orthodoxy. And be it Confucian, be it the modern Japanese imperial cult. And anything that is seen as a direct challenge to the orthodoxy that legitimizes political rule will be crushed. And in Japanese history, for example, the Nichiren school of Buddhism is an example of that, which had to be crushed because it was seen as a dangerous dissent from orthodoxy. The reason that the Christians were seen as a threat, I mean, in terms of military might and so on, they were no threat at all. But it is precisely, again, with the help of the Dutch, who wanted a monopoly on trade in Japan. They were quite eager to tell the shogun that they should crack down on these bad Portuguese missionaries and so on because they were a danger. But the reason that Christianity in the end, despite an early sympathy amongst the political elite in Edo for Christianity, that they had to crack down on them is because it was seen as a challenge to orthodoxy. And I think the same is true in China. And it may not be exactly the same as the kind of struggles between, as Luther and the Catholic Church and so on, but it's analogous. Shell.
Hi. In one of your earlier books on Chinese rebels from Los Angeles to Beijing, you mentioned that Chinese dissidents in transnational contexts have a particular affinity with Christianity.
Yes.
And you looked at, so in light of this recent developments such as Falun Gong and some of these trajectory of Chinese Christianity, do you still feel that dissidents in China, especially in contemporary times and in the future, would still have the same particular affinity with Christianity that you talked about in your book previously?
Are still what?
Would they still have the same affinity with Christianity?
Well, it is indeed remarkable how many people, whether it's Singapore or China or Taiwan or indeed in modern Japanese history too, how many people who dissented from the official orthodoxy were Christians. And Christians would argue, of course, that this is because something inherent in Christianity, that because Christianity offers equality and before God and so on, that it lends itself naturally to democratic development. And even non-Christians, I mean, I remember the astrophysicist Feng Lizhi, the Chinese dissident who's now in Arizona, once seriously telling me, and he's certainly not the only one, and he was reflecting a fairly common opinion, that because the Chinese did not have Christianity, they didn't have the Enlightenment, and therefore they were sort of backward in their democratic development. And I don't believe this for a minute, but I do think there's a reason why Christianity appeals. I mean, partly it's the egalitarianism, and that was certainly true in Korea, for example, where most early Christian converts were converted by Korean missionaries, not foreigners, who picked it up in studying in China and came back, and they were usually members of the lower classes, not the gentry, not the Yangbang. And it was one way to fight, but the egalitarianism of Christianity was one way to fight back against the hierarchical nature of Korean society. And Islam, of course, appeals to many people for the same reasons. I mean, it's why outcasts in Indian history often were converted to Islam. But the other reason is precisely because, I think, the importance of orthodoxy is a legitimating factor in politics, that if orthodoxy legitimizes rule that you think is unjust, you need a counter-orthodoxy, and preferably a moral counter-orthodoxy. And that, again, is not just a Chinese or a Japanese or an Asian phenomenon. The role of the Catholic Church in Poland in fighting communism was enormously important. It's an institution that gives you a kind of moral, institutional legitimacy to fight the official orthodoxy. And I think that's one reason why so many dissidents are either Christian converts or were Christians to begin with. I mean, just to add to that, state Shinto, the people who promoted state Shinto in the 1920s and 30s in Japan did not do so because they argued that Shinto was a religion. They in fact argued that Shinto was not a religion, it was culture. And that Christians were a danger because they were religious. And being religious, they had loyalties that were un-Japanese. And so it was in a sort of perverse way, they were arguing against the Christians along sort of secular lines, if you like. But so I think there are plausible reasons why there are so many Christians. And who knows? I mean, in China today, there are many Christian converts, but Buddhism, or various forms of Buddhism, are also spreading. And all things like Falun Gong. And I think the government is not entirely wrong to fear that kind of development, but of course they're digging their own grave, because if you don't allow people to legitimately take part in politics, have a political voice, they're going to look for all kinds of other ways in which to express themselves, and religion is an obvious one.
Yeah, I had a question about the new religions in post-war Japan. I mean, you referred to the initial wave right after World War II, but you didn't really talk about the really large new religions today, particularly Soka Gakkai, which has several million members and has its own political party that has been in and out of government. And I just wondered how that fit into your interpretation of religion and politics, religion and democracy, since it's a very aggressive proselytizer. It doesn't particularly recognize a separation between religion and politics.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. Of course, the Soka Gakkai is not just a Japanese phenomenon, but I think I'm right. But correct me if I'm wrong. But it did come up at the same time as the Rush Hour of the Gods. And yes, but I mean, it's great. It really took off after the war, and I would imagine it took off for the same reasons, that with the bankruptcy of the wartime orthodoxy that people had been educated to sort of believe in deeply, there was a sense of suddenly of not believing in anything, and which was led on the one hand amongst writers to a kind of celebration of nihilism almost. I mean, the sort of decadent school of not what was his name? Sakaguchi Ango is Darakuron. Wasn't it Darakuron? And sort of celebrating the fact that we shouldn't believe in anything anymore. All belief is nonsense, and it's all about sex and so on, and which was for a while very popular amongst Japanese writers. But I think that wasn't good enough for many people, so it wasn't for nothing that these organizations took off, because people were desperate to believe in something. And the reasons probably why, and here I'm just speculating, but the reasons why the Soka Gakkai and other Buddhist-related new religions are popular are the same reasons that the Falun Gong was popular in China, because it was native, I mean, it was traditional, something that was recognizable. It wasn't Western. It had charismatic leaders. It was often worldly in that it promised worldly success as well as other things, and as you say, it got deeply involved in politics from the very beginning, I think, and it was, but which was not strange to Japanese. After all, their politics had been soaked in metaphysics for a long time by that stage. You're looking a bit skeptical.
I think it is unusual, though, to have I mean, it's often considered a more a European approach in the sense that you have a new religion, very aggressive outside the state, that organizes its own subculture and aggressive, and its religion is very aggressive. That doesn't strike me as sort of mainstream.
Well, except if, maybe not mainstream, but if you go back into Japanese history, there are a lot of other examples. I mean, the Nichiren is one. All those very militant Buddhist monastic orders are another. I mean, they were a real political force. And so, as a form of sometimes rebellion, sometimes a kind of alternative to mainstream political power, religion always had been a factor. And so, again, I think it's a sign that these things are not a uniquely European phenomenon. Well, I've read things about it, and I've forgotten too much of what I've read to pronounce on this subject. I'd rather that somebody spoke about that who has more expertise. It's a slightly... I would start bluffing if I tried to give you an interesting answer. I mean, it's certainly a significant subject, and it was changed and politicized and so on. I think the only thing I could say is that there were constant tensions between the Shinto clergy, such as it was, and for whom the Ise Shrine was one of the major institutions, and those who sought to politicize Shinto in the name of the emperor cult, and who pretended it wasn't really a religion, which on the one hand boosted Shinto, but on the other hand diminished the authority of the clerics. But exactly how it changed and when, I mean, the details I don't remember enough. Maybe somebody else could say something, but...
In response to this, it's a very different. In thinking about some of your writings, like Murder in Amsterdam or Wages of Guilt, it's very clear what your position is there. And listening to these, what your lectures seem more sort of distanced. Other writings are analytical, to be sure. But one knows very clearly, reading Murder in Amsterdam.
Well, not everybody thought so. I've been criticized by the neocons for being an appeaser and a lackey of Islamism, and I've been criticized by the left for being a neo-imperialist and so on. So,
well, I can only say it was clear to me. Right?
Well, I'm very glad that at least some people got it. Well, you mean my position towards religion per se, or
or sort of what's driving you in your thoughts on these?
Well, I suppose I would have to say that I feel akin to Spinoza, in that I think it's an illusion and often a dogmatic illusion to believe that religion will just disappear, that it's some kind of primitive superstition, and once with better education and superior knowledge and so on, we will be above all that and it'll just go away. I don't think that. I think that the desire to believe in higher meaning, ritualizing what is mysterious about life and so on, is so strong that religion always will be a force. And if you try and take it away if you try and force people out of it, then the same impulses will be directed against other things. I mean, then it leads to Stalinism or Maoism, or in its benign form, the worship of Paris Hilton, maybe. But or Madonna. I mean, she's not called Madonna for nothing. She knows what she's doing, and so I think it's a human impulse. It's a human desire. So the question is not how to get rid of it. The question is how to tame it, like violence. I mean, I think violence is part of the human impulse too. And the issue is, how do you stop it from doing too much damage? And so I think what I'm trying to explore in these three lectures is really how people have tried to do that, and either successfully or unsuccessfully. And my interest in Islam in Europe, which will be the next talk, and was, of course, in some ways the subject of the Murder in Amsterdam, is very much part of that. So, just to answer your question in a little more detail, I mean, I don't go along with the Dawkins-Hitchens school that it's all absurd and backward and ridiculous and we should just ridicule it until it goes away. I mean, it won't go away, so you have to find a place for it. And the place for it, I think, can be legitimate. I don't think, for example, that, let's say, evangelical Christians who come to a particular political view, which that political view is illegitimate just because it's based on a religious view of the world. It's politically legitimate as long as the view can be rationally discussed. The religion can't be rationally discussed. If somebody thinks that the world moves in a certain way because there is God in heaven, I don't believe that. But you can come to a certain ethical conclusion about particular issues based on that, which can be perfectly reasonably discussed. And again, I think some people are too ready to simply dismiss it because it has mystical or irrational sources.
Then does taming, I mean, you use the word taming, which seems to be this then mean really a kind of strict separation of church?
Yes. As institutions, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a sine qua non of any democratic system. I mean, that religious authority should never be the same as political authority. So I think, in other words, that the Japanese got it right during the Tokugawa period. I mean, and then, although it helped them in one sense, but made a big mistake to blur the two in the late 19th century.
I have a rather bold comment, and I hope you pardon me if I make any mistake. So I understand the interesting lecture, and the main point is that the legitimacy of governance and the legitimacy of rebellion in relation to religion. However, in concern of Chinese religion, I believe that you mentioned heaven and the Confucian orthodoxy as well as Chinese religion. But there is some confusion in the very term of the heaven, because I think there are many uses of this heaven, especially in the earlier Chinese classics, which the Jesuits brought back to Europe and believe they found the trace of God. And in those classics, including like the Book of Oaths and the Book of Documents, the heaven is rather like ancestral, like existence. However, the emperor's ancestors are actually intermediators between the heaven and the emperor himself. And later on, these kind of ritual behaviors, like in the spring they plant the earth, etc., these are understood more ritualistic rather than religious. And again, about the Confucian orthodoxy, actually Confucius himself is a very interesting figure because he himself is not an emperor, but the people believe he got the orthodoxy. So after the 9th century, the Confucian orthodoxy is actually different from the orthodoxy of the governors. Hence, the Confucian orthodoxy usually existed in the hands of the scholars, who most of the times are not member of the government. And again, about the legitimacy of rebellion, I think the heavenly mandate is one issue that people use to legitimize their rebellion. However, most of the etiology of these rebellions are actually like a potpourri of all kinds of religions, including Buddhism very much, and native Taoism, as well as all kinds of popular religion, as you said, the pantheism, like the gods and deities are everywhere. So I think all these things maybe should be clarified a little bit. And especially the Chinese case is quite different from the Japanese case, which also should be like distinguished.
Yes, no, of course the Chinese case is different. But, I mean, Confucianism, as you know, could be many different things in many different periods to many different people. And Confucius himself, I don't think, was a dogmatic thinker. I mean, he was rather a flexible thinker who left enormous room for doubt and so on. So he was not a man who imposed orthodoxy. But I think in the course of Chinese history, Confucianism did become an orthodoxy, and the scholar officials, after all, were people who worked for rulers. I mean, they were employed by the state, and although in theory their role was to make sure that the ruler was virtuous, in fact, I think their role was to to ensure that the orthodoxy was, or that the orthodoxy served the legitimacy of the state, and they were not they were the opposite of being rebellious, and the reason that that millenarian rebellions were usually engaged in because of folk religion and Buddhism and Taoist cults and so on, was partly because they were unleashed by people of a different class, although in the case of the Taiping he was a Confucian scholar, but partly because, a bit like the Christians in modern China, it was an alternative to a challenge to the orthodoxy, which was on the whole Confucian. And on heaven, sure, I mean, it's not the same thing as God in Christianity or Allah in Islam, but it was a metaphysical concept. It was something that was above this world. And in that sense, I would call it religious. I mean, the rituals to the sun and so on were religious rituals. It wasn't sort of part of rational discourse.
The reason I mentioned the Confucian orthodoxy different from the orthodoxy of the state is because there is a discussion of the term 圣人 means the sage. So usually before Confucius, the sage, the term 圣人 is reserved only for the emperors. But Confucius was regarded as a sage, a 圣人. But he's not an emperor, he's not even a state official. So it is the continuity of Chinese civilization, people believe, are realized in the hand of Confucius, and that legitimacy could broken for 100 years and be succeeded again at a certain point by important scholar. So that kind of orthodoxy is called 道统, different from 正统. 正统 means the orthodoxy of the state. 道统 means orthodoxy of the way. And the way is usually not in the hand of the emperors. And hence the scholars, they do have a kind of their rights to criticize the state, especially in the Song dynasty, which is my comment.
No, I think that's true, but there are two, if you like, two traditions going on. I mean, and Confucius was a political advisor. I mean, he was a sage maybe, but his job was to be a political consultant. He wanted to teach political people and how to rule their states successfully, and he wasn't very successful in doing this. But that was what he was set out to do. And what he did, you're quite right. I mean, he had no power and so on. But I think that the Confucianism, as distinct from purely only the ideas that Confucius himself expressed, did become an orthodoxy that was used to legitimize power, which is not to say that there's no difference between the emperor and the scholars, of course, but the role of the scholars was to legitimize power, and I think you still see it. It's still something that makes intellectual life in Japan and China and Korea and so on a problem, in that many intellectuals still see it as their role, are very easily maneuvered into a position that they become spokesmen for legitimizing power, and rebels are very lonely figures usually. And again, this is, I think, why Christianity appeals, because if you're an independent thinker and you're trying to dissent from the orthodoxy that legitimizes the power, it's very comforting to have a sort of a worldwide institutional source of moral authority to back you up.
We should probably wrap it up, and
Thank you
very much, Buruma, for